Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. It finally happened. We got a Persians remake. Yes, I know this is old news, but I was having a baby at the time, so you can forgive me for taking a little while to catch up. I did my own build on the Persians a little while back. I was very pleased with it. And the new one, while it's not exactly what I would have wanted, it's not too far off. But that doesn't stop me from wanting more, especially because the new Persians doesn't fix some of the innate problems I had with the civilization. The biggest one being that Persia is so much more than the Sassanids and the Safavids. And that's really all that we see represented in the current civilization. Notwithstanding the fact that those two massive nations were over 1,000 years separated, which is just too much time to all pack into one. So in my opinion, the Persians need to be split. There are so many more amazing Iranian peoples who could be represented in the game, and in my opinion, deserve a chance at inclusion. And so, in this video, we will be asking ourselves, how much can Age of Empires 2 split the Persians? In addition, we'll also be talking about adding more civilizations to the Caucasus in general. Not because all Caucasian civilizations are Iranian or Persian in origin, not even close to that, but because in the past, such civilizations have often been represented by the Persians because there hasn't been a better civ to represent them, arguably. I would love to hear your opinions on my picks for this list down below. Anything that you see that I have missed, or any bits of the history that I have misrepresented, I really would love you to share. It's because of you guys that I have filled gaps in my knowledge so often over the years. And also, huge shout out to my good friend on Discord, Temudin. He has been instrumental in helping form the foundations of this list. And so my friend, maybe I could have done it without you, but it would have been absolutely miserable to do so. So my deepest and sincerest thanks to you. So let's begin with a discussion of who qualifies. What civilizations will I be talking about in this video? Well, first of all, let's talk about the concept of Persianization. Persian culture, even after the Sassanid Empire, the last Persian Empire, I say in huge scare quotes, fell, Persian culture was still seen as the peak of society. A lot of dynasties in the Middle East, Central Asia, Northern India, all over the place, used a claim to Persian lineage to legitimize their rules, tying them back in to some of these legendary empires like the Achaemenids and the Sassanids that were still talked about at the time. Or even if they weren't trying to legitimize a claim, Persian culture was used to help you seem upper class. It was the fancy people culture. Learning Persian was kind of like learning Latin in Europe, except it made you even fancier. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, Latin was kind of a lingua franca for the upper class. Persian was similar, but also kind of elevated you further. Now, like I said, Persianization can be found as far as India. There were even a couple of actual Persian dynasties in India. But those civilizations aren't all that we're going to be talking about. Instead, the primary deciding factor for who qualifies for this list will be, prior to DE, could these civilizations have been repped by the Persian civilization in campaigns if there were no better one to fill? Now, there's going to be a little bit of wiggle room here because a couple of these civilizations could definitely be called Turkic rather than Persian, but I've done my best to make a deciding cut, especially because when I do one of these vids for the Turks, it's going to be miserably long. So I'm going to try to put as much of it here as I possibly can. I should note there are also some really painfully bad cases where Persian or specifically Iranian civilizations were represented by civilizations other than the Persians. Viking Allens, anyone? That still hurts me. And there's some less egregious ones as well, such as when the Georgians were represented by the Persians in the original Tamerlane campaign, though that was after DE. We're going to try to hit a balance on this list of civilizations that are actually Iranian in origin, or ones that have like a lot of Turkic influences but still are distinctly Persianized. With that said, let us move on to what we have thus far. On my channel, that is. I have obviously done my own Persians build. Give myself a fat pat on the back for that one. I thought it was pretty awesome. I focused entirely on the Sassanids, which I think is very important, and it's one of the reasons I will not be mentioning the Sassanids anywhere else in this presentation. I think my Persians build did it well enough, in my opinion. Now, the Persians were obviously fully reworked. It wasn't bad, but I liked mine a lot better. And I think with like 2 changes, the current Persians build could properly represent the Sassanids, while having some incoming builds do a better job of representing the Safavids and other later Persianized states. Additionally, we can talk about the Georgians and the Armenians. I've done my own builds for both. Go take a look at them up here. They're not Persian, of course, but they are in a very similar area, and the Georgians were historically represented by the Persians in that one campaign example, so it feels relevant to mention them now. The Georgians were my first build after all, and the Armenians my 31st, and I made both of those before the official builds came out. The official Georgians weren't terrible in my opinion, but the Armenians were dog do. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Another thing that we have done on this channel talking about the Persians and the Persianized peoples would be some of the regionals that I've made for my builds. For example, making the Caravanserai more regional. That was something I actually guessed the Persians would get in my own build as well. I buffed it up from current and made it a lot more versatile and variable. But the other thing I'd like to briefly touch upon is my idea of the Tower Elephant. Rather than giving the Sassanid Persians a War Elephant unique unit, instead to make a regional unit available to all manner of civilizations, not just Persian ones. In fact, Persian ones would not universally get it, not even close. That would be like an awesome centerpiece elephant that would give the War Elephant experience without taking up a valuable unique unit slot and making it available to all sorts of other cool civilizations who really deserve to have it. So if you want more details on either of those, the easiest place to find them would be in my Persians build that I did recently. But what else can we add from here? Let us begin by taking a look at the must-haves. In my opinion, these two civilizations, more than any others, deserve to be in the game. Devs, please take note, I really want these. First, the Alani, or the Alans, as you may have heard them called. They are a Caucasian Iranian people. They have one of the most interesting and dynamic stories of the AoE2 timeframe. They were a migratory people who eventually ended up coming all the way across Europe. In the process, teaming up with the Vandals, trying to get into Rome during the barbarian invasions, eventually going through France, founding the Vandal kingdom after merging with the Vandal peoples and making a combined partially Germanic, partially Iranic state. It was so freaking cool. But that wasn't all that the Alani did. That was only a splinter group of them. The remainder stayed in the Caucasus and founded the Christian kingdom of Alania, which held on until it was conquered by the Mongols in the 1200s. I think the way I would personally implement the Alani in-game would be as like a cool cavalry archer civilization with like an early mid-game focus and some really cool team play stuff to represent the combined kingdom of Vandals and Alans, and some nice late-game defenses to represent them holding out in the last days of their Christian kingdom. The other must-have, in my opinion, are the Khwarezmians. Do you know what Khwarezm is? I hope you do. It's in Age of Empires and has been there since Age of Kings. It was a major empire just south of the Aral Sea. Iranian in origin, though of course absorbed many Turkic influences, not to mention being on the Silk Road and being a major factor on the Silk Road. It picked up stuff from the Chinese and the Mongols and all sorts of stuff. It became a bit of a cultural and economic crossroads. Many different states rose and fell in the general Khwarezm region, but the biggest and most important one for sure was the Khwarezmid Empire, which went from like the 1000s to 1200s AD, eventually destroyed, as so many others were, by the Mongols on their warpath through to the west along the Silk Road. The Khwarezmians, in my opinion, would probably be some sort of economy-focused civilization, maybe like a camel civ too, but the history would have to bear that out. I haven't done the research yet. Thriving in the mid-game sounds appropriate with like some cool outplay potential, given that they actually put up a serious fight against the Mongols, but finally falling off in post-imperial when their empire eventually collapsed. No other Khwarezmian empire would rise after the Khwarezmids themselves, though of course the area would continue to play an absolutely pivotal role and would be a huge part of, for example, Tamerlane's heartland when he ruled Central Asia. Given that they have such a unique story, were a major player on the world stage, and have been in the game since Age of Kings, I think the Khwarezmians are one of the biggest misses in the modern game today. Now, with the must-haves covered, let's talk about some of my other top contenders. I don't think these are as obvious as those first two, but still really deserve to be in. First, the Azeris. Until I did my research, I didn't really realize how important the country we now know as Azerbaijan is. Azerbaijan was still considered kind of its own thing very, very far back in the day. It was Iranian, of course, and later would have some heavy Turkic and Arabic influences too. While Azerbaijan was conquered quite a lot over the years, it was independently ruled quite a lot. First of all, a series of kind of autonomous city-states called the Shirvanshahs ruled it for like 700 years on and off. Even though it was, again, conquered pretty extensively, there were always some independent Shirvanshahs still holding out. But more importantly, Azerbaijan was the birthplace of the Safavid Empire. If you don't know who they are what gave rise to the stupid citadels technology for the new Persians, the one that lets the castle shoot bullets. I think the effect is great. doesn't belong on the Persians. The Safavids were a gunpowder empire, one of a handful of powerful Islamic nations that rose during the 15th and 16th century and just conquered frickin' everything. And the Safavids were really good at it. They are an incredibly important nation during the tail end of the AoE2 timeframe. In terms of my best guess for how they would play, I think they'd have to be a gunpowder civilization. Like a defensive early game to represent the Shirvanshah times, and then a huge early imperial power spike to represent the Safavids conquering everything in sight. I think it would be awesome. Gunpowder civilizations are fun. Next, the Afghans. So Afghanistan has a pretty complicated history. I'm not going to do it anywhere near amount of justice, but I will say you could also call this civilization the Pashtuns. That is the more proper name for the people. But Afghans were how they were largely called by almost everyone, including during the Middle Ages. This is not just a modern invention. So Afghans, Pashtuns, either works in my opinion. The Afghans were an Iranian people, originally at least, but they had a ton of Turkic influence, like many others, and also a lot of North Indian influences, a really interesting crossroads between the three. In terms of who the Afghan civilization could represent, the Kabul Shahis were a presence during the early side of the AoE2 relevant time frame. The Sur Empire in the 1500s was also of Afghan origin. They conquered a lot of North India, but only held it for a little while. But most importantly, the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavids were one of the most relevant empires in Central Asia prior to Tamerlane. They conquered a ton, a lot of Central Asia, some Northern India, well into Persia and Iran. Actually originally established by, I believe, a Mamluk family. I don't know, it's really, really complicated. Central Asian history is not my specialty. But I still think the Ghaznavids absolutely need inclusion in the game, and the Afghans are a perfect contender for them, while also representing a number of other really important nations and states as well. My best guess for how the Afghans would play would be like a skirmishing civilization with a trash focus and getting a lot of early map control, and then having a gunpowder transition. And so the Afghans and the Azeris, while I don't think they are as mandatory, would add beautifully to the fullness of Central Asia, which still, in my opinion, is somewhat missing in Age of Empires 2. More than somewhat, even. Now, let's talk about some mid-contenders. Not nearly as important as the others. It would be awesome to see them, but I do think there are higher priorities out there. The Tajiks, first of all. They were an Eastern Iranian people with a really varied blend of influences. They had Turkic influences, they had Hunnic influences, Indian, Chinese influences. If you want to talk a melting pot, it's the Tajik areas. If you're having trouble placing them in your mind's map, think of them as being nestled in the western crook of the Himalayas. So most importantly, the Tajiks would represent Sogdia and Bactria, two earlier nations during the AoE2 timeframe, only being truly fully conquered by 1000-ish AD. Later on, though, the Khartid dynasty would also be of Tajik origin, and while not nearly as important as some of the other major dynasties I've talked about, they certainly deserve to be included in the game, especially to round out the corners left by the very prominent and important inclusions of Sogdia and Bactria. In terms of how the Tajiks would play, they'd have to be a cavalry civilization. Maybe they could have the coveted perfect stable of every single major cavalry unit available. But they would have to be scrappy and adaptive and play well on the back foot, maybe with some built-in catch-up mechanisms, because they were kind of always on the back foot. Another example of a mid-contender, in my opinion, would be the Kurds. The Kurds have one of the most complicated histories I've ever looked at, so I'm going to try my best to summarize. So they're a Western Iranian people, kind of between Persia and Armenia. They had a couple of small independent states, but they rose and fell and eventually got conquered. But the Kurds were best known for their work as mercenaries and kingmakers, and Kurdish dynasties would go on to rule some of the most important nations of the era. You know, Salah ad-Din, the Ayyubid dynasty, that was Kurdish in origin. Not to say that I think the Kurds would best represent something like that, but there might be some other nations that they do deserve to represent as the leadership class in those states. So a really funky civilization. My best guess for how they'd actually play is an elite-focused civilization with a really limited economy, forcing some sort of unbelievably funky playstyle where you I don't know, hire out your soldiers to enemies or some crap like that. It's something cool. I'm not sure yet, but all I know is that the Kurds, if nothing else, should strongly be considered for the game. Now from here, we're starting to move into murkier waters. The long shots, stuff that would be so cool to have, but there's definitely much higher priorities, and this would be the sort of thing I'd want to see in a decade, if we're still going strong with AoE2. One, the Daylamites. Now, these are northwestern Iranian peoples on the Caspian coast. They were the only region actually able to hold out against the Arabic conquest in the 700s and 800s, which by itself is pretty impressive. Bear in mind, this was the invasion that brought down the Sassanid Empire. The Daylamites did have a couple of their own independent dynasties as well, such as the Buyid dynasty, which ruled from the 900s to like the 1100s AD, and conquered well beyond the Daylamite region itself, but beyond that they only had a couple of small powers and were most known, once again, kind of like the Kurds, as mercenaries. Absolutely ferocious in combat. But unlike the Kurds, they were not nearly as globetrotting, mostly only fighting for other Iranian powers nearby. My best guess for them would be an infantry civilization with a big focus on the early and mid-game and a defensive late game. They're going to be a holdout civilization who's able to absolutely mow down opponents coming to their front door, but is not going to be very mobile. A really different playstyle from a lot of the other more cavalry-focused civilizations we've touched upon thus far. Another long shot, the Cilicians, or Kilikians, as I was corrected by a commenter in a previous video. I'll give them a star because they are not Persian. The Kilikians are Armenian. The current Armenian build is pretty much entirely focused on Kilikia, and that's like a generous interpretation. It might just be poo, right? But I choose to believe that they were focusing on Kilikian Armenia rather than Armenia proper for some goddamn reason. I mentioned Kilikia too in my Armenia build, but it wasn't nearly the focus of that build. And so I think a proper Kilikia focused build as like a subdivision of the Armenians could be really cool. I'm not really sure what it would look like. Probably navy and defenses. And I'm guessing and kind of hoping it doesn't look too much like the official, but if I do my research and their build looks perfect in retrospect, I will give my sincerest apologies. Either way, I think they deserve at least a consideration as an inclusion. But let's move on now to the mega long shots. Stuff that really might not belong in the game at all, but I think it would be a shame not to mention, and if I had my way and I got 200 plus civilizations into the game, these guys would make it in. The Tabaris, first of all. You could also call them the Mazandaranis, but I think Tabaris is slightly more accurate. They are northern Iranian, inhabiting the south coast of the Caspian Sea in a very mountainous region, kind of right next to the Daylamite region. They had a bunch of major city centers, like economic city centers, and were famed for silk. They had a bunch of like minor dynasties arise from the region, like the Davuyids most notably, but they also had the single longest ruling Persian dynasty of all time, namely the Baduspanids. That was from 600s AD to the 1500s AD. Over 900 years completely unconquered. It took the Safavid Empire to bring them down. That's pretty freaking cool. At least deserves some sort of mention in the game. My best guess, eco-defensive civilization, maybe some religious stuff, given that the Tabaris actually held out as Zoroastrian a little bit longer, but also adopted a lot of Islamic stuff, so maybe some sort of like cross-religious thing going on there. Could be cool. And the Circassians, another asterisk here because these are also not a Persian or Iranic people. You could also call them the Kasogs or the Adiga. The Adiga is, I believe, how they refer to themselves, so if you wanted to be most respectful, you could go with that. They are an indigenous people of the Caucasus. They're kind of northish of Georgia, still on the Black Sea. And while they got conquered by pretty much everyone from Bulgars to Mongols to everything in between, they did have a short-lived independent state in the 1400s and were again famed for their bravery and ferocity. They had a very mountainous region, so even when they were invaded, there were always Circassian resistance groups that would be trying to kick out whatever invader of the century was giving them trouble. I think if I had to guess, they would be kind of like a, for want of a better term, a stationary nomad civilization. So like nomadic, but defensive, with a really micro-intensive skirmishing playstyle and like a good early imperial to represent that short-lived independent state. Do I think they are a high priority for the game? No, but man, would it be cool. Alrighty, friends. From here, we go into fantasy dreamland territory. The ultra mega long shots. Stuff that really I couldn't countenance putting in the game until we had dotted every I and crossed every T, and we were just adding more civilizations for the sheer joy of it. Let's talk about the Balochs. They were an Eastern Iranian people, originally kind of like a migratory raiding people who would like prey on merchants, but eventually driven by frustrated superpowers all the way down into the southern coast of what is now Pakistan in like the 900s AD. They effectively kept getting attacked and persecuted and kept having to retreat to more and more arid and inhospitable regions for protection, eventually adapting very effectively to those arid and inhospitable lands. They really didn't have any noteworthy states during the AoE2 timeframe, not that I could find at the very least, but they were still a relevant player and caused a lot of problems for some other major powers of the time, such as the Ghaznavids and the Saffarids, and a little bit the Sassanids as well. My best guess for how they would play is like a camel civilization with a big focus on raiding and like environmental attrition. If you've seen my Wends build, go take a look at it here, I think they would play kind of similar to that. Maybe spreading some sort of unique terrain and using it to like indirectly whittle down opponents' armies. Really, really cool, but definitely an ultra mega long shot for the game. Here's another one, the Zerdzooks. This is another not Iranian people. This is an exonym for the Vainakh peoples. Vainakh also being an exonym, this is specifically referring to the Chechens, the Ingush, and the Bats, all of whom inhabit the kind of mountainous heart of the Caucasus Mountains, nearish to Georgia and often incorporated into other like major empires of the era. They were also, like the Circassians, an indigenous Caucasian people. They didn't have any prominent states, but various chroniclers and maps of the era would refer to them as having their own homelands and being an autonomously governed people to some degree. They were usually vassals or allies to like one of their neighbors, and like the Circassians, they were certainly tough. They held out very well against invaders and fought fiercely alongside their various allies, especially against the incoming Turks and Mongols. My best guess is they would be a tower civilization with a really good early game backed up by decent infantry. This is because they were famous for these really quite beautiful obelisk-looking tower structures that they were building as early as like 200 AD. And I think that like an early game pain-in-your-ass tower rushing civilization, while I don't want to have many of those in the game, when the history backs it up this well, I think there deserves to be at least one or two. And that is it. Those are all the civilizations between the Iranian peoples and a few indigenous Caucasian peoples that I wanted to cover in this presentation. But before we sign off, let's also talk about some more regional. I wasn't able to find quite as many regional options as I might have liked, but there's certainly quite a few that I'd like to talk to you all about now. First of all, the Cataphract. I do not think that the Cataphract should be a unique unit for the Byzantines. Cataphracts were used all over the damn place. It would need to be some sort of knight replacement or maybe a knight supplement, tankier, lower damage, something like that. I frankly think the knight itself should work very differently to how it does now and have like a separate heavy cavalry unit, with the knight being like a regional for European civilizations, and the Cataphract could be kind of a regional iteration of that generalized heavy cavalry unit for Central Asia as well as into East Asia. Cataphracts were extremely pervasive. I see them as like a brawler cavalry, good against infantry and archers, but weak against enemy cavalry, because that's often how they fought. Maybe they could even retain the trample effect off of the current Byzantines one. The Byzantines would need a new unique unit, and that isn't hard to do at all. The Byzantine army was one of the most multifaceted and funky ones in the medieval world. I'm sure we could come up with a dozen unique Byzantine units, and I'm sure I will someday. I could even countenance them having like a unique version of the Cataphract to pay some homage to the original civilization. Like I said, they could be available as far as East Asia. They were so pervasive. The Jurchens used cataphracts, for Christ's sake. Some northern Indian peoples used cataphracts. Cataphracts deserve to be in the game as a regional unit, almost as common as the camel. Rant over. Now let's talk about the macemen. So obviously the macemen would have to be some sort of core infantry unit, probably reasonably heavy armored, either replacing or existing alongside the sword line. And while maces were not only used in Persia, and I could see this unit being very widespread, Persia was quite famous for them. I see the macemen as being like a tough unit, slower than a sword, generally less damage, but specialized against like heavy armored or elite units. So that way maybe they could have like either an armor ignoring effect, or probably not an armor stripping effect, maybe like an attack bonus against elites, something like that, to make it so that unlike the trash specialized sword line, the macemen could still do something against trash, but would be much better against the elites that normally chew through swordsmen. And like I said, tons of other powers used macemen. European powers use maces all the time, Indian powers use maces all the time, African powers use maces all the time. I'm sure you could make an argument that Mesoamerican powers use macemen all the time. So while I don't think they should necessarily replace the sword line, and I'd personally prefer to see them parallel to the swordsman line in the barracks, I think that they would make a really interesting inclusion that would give some more nuance to the barracks and also better fit the history, where swords were not a common battlefield weapon, at least not as a primary arm for infantry. Now, beyond these two, there's a couple other more general regional topics we could talk about here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. For example, in my Saracens split video, go take a look at that there, as well as my West African video, actually, I talked a lot about like potential new camel units to be added. Camels are like largely overstated in terms of their importance in medieval strategy games, and so I'm not actually convinced that this is a good idea. Could talk about more elephant stuff as well. Yes, there are Persianized powers who imported elephants to use in war, but it really wasn't that common, so I think this is a conversation better saved for another video. Some more gunpowder stuff, like the Safavids used a lot of gunpowder, but I don't really have enough for you right now to want to talk about it here. And what else would you suggest? I feel like I'm missing a lot of potential regionals for this area, partially because I haven't done like a proper deep dive into the history yet. So if you have any insights, please do share them with me in the comment section on all of these topics, but especially on regionals, because that's where I feel like my knowledge is most limited. And with that, we come to the end of this Persian splitting adventure. Thank you all so much for watching, and now I want to hear more from you guys. What did I miss? I'm sure I missed something at the very least. And how far would you personally take this split? For me, my cutoff would be like the mid-Contenders region, though of course I'd love to see all the long shot stuff. I'll probably tackle them on the channel someday, because we aren't about pragmatics here. So make your voices heard, share your opinions below. Iranian history and Central Asian history more broadly is super underrated, and it was really fun and engaging getting to learn a little bit more about it, and I hope that you learned a little something yourself as well. And so that's all for today, and until we meet again, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.